They are flowing in. Take it away, James.
Okay. Well, good morning. Good morning. Greetings to you all. In our Lakota language, we say, Yahi, welcome all. Hawmidakiapi, Chante, Western Nape, Chisapalo, James Rallingleaf, Imachapi, Nasu Chunga, Lakota, and Mataha. Welcome to the inaugural Ecological Society of America Traditional Ecological Knowledge webinar series. That's a mouthful, so I'm going to use acronyms today, if you don't mind, ESA and also TEK. So we're so happy that you're with us today. We're going to get started in about a minute, give people a chance to filter in. But we're so glad that you're with us. Again, my name is James Rallingleaf. I'm the chair of the TEK section today, and we're so happy that you're with us, and we're looking forward to a great time together with our honored guest and our honored speaker. So we'll start in 1 minute. So just hang with us as people come in. So welcome everybody again. My name is James Rallingleaf again. I greet you with a good handshake and a good heart. We're going to start here in a few seconds here to get our webinar kicked off. I'll be serving as a moderator. Again, welcome to the ESA TEK section webinar series. So happy that you're with us, and we're looking forward to a good time. In terms of housekeeping rules, again, we have our chat function here, also a Q&A section here. So please share your questions, your ideas with our speakers, and so that we can address them, and also have some documentation of that as well as we go forward. So we're going to get started here in a few seconds, so just bear with us. Again, welcome. Dayahi. So let's get started. Again, my name is James Rallingleaf. I serve as chair of the Traditional Ecological Knowledge section of the Ecological Society of America. ESA as an overall is a 7,000 plus membership. We're real happy that they sponsored and working with us to do this webinar, first webinar series in the TEK section for many years. And it's my pleasure to serve in a leadership role with that. And because it's TEK and it's because we are Indigenous people, when we do these things, when we come together like this in a good way, we ask and seek our elders and our knowledge holders to help us start these things in a good way. And it's my honor and pleasure today to welcome Ione Quigley from my tribe, from my people, to help us today with an opening prayer and also some words of encouragement. We have an hour of us today, and so we're all grateful that Ione's here with us. I've known Ione since 2000, over 20 years. We've worked together with many projects and many things, and she has a very important job right now. She's our Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and so she has a tremendous responsibility to care for those most important things of our culture. And she's also been an educator with Ecological University, Tribal College, and our reservation on the Rosebud Sioux, and she's just a tremendous leader, and she's a friend and a colleague of mine and a relative. So with that, Ione, I want to turn it over to you for our prayer and also for our words of encouragement. Ione.
Well, Pila, can you hear me, see me? First of all, I want to introduce myself so that you know who I am and you know where I come from. I was always told by my father that if people know you, when we see you, we know what you do. You don't have to talk about yourself. Well, if you stand and talk before people that you've never met before, tell them where you come from. Tell them who you are. So I will let you know, as James said, I have been department chair and instructor at Ecological University for a little over 20 years. And then I moved on to working with the K-12 school here, the treaty school that we have in our tribe. And I was there for 7 years, and then I decided that I really needed to use my education and my training that I had gotten from really, really awesome mentors such as Victor DeVille, Albert Whitehat, and others, Dr. Bill Akerd, who have led me down a path of realizing that I needed to fulfill some obligations with my people by helping to preserve our culture. So with that, that is what I do now. It's not easy work. It's almost a full-time 24/7 at times that I do, but I enjoy it. I enjoy it. I think that one of the things about our jobs is that we're happy doing it. That is so important. I am going to make a prayer that will tell Ochimaka and all the resources that we have and each other as relatives that we are one. Ho Tongashila wa Kantaka. Dako Henani Trawa. Dako Henani Trawana Oyaki Hippie. You can't hatieto paki hena ahi tompina. Ampetu kilel wian oshikacha. Hoye waye. You can wash ago yan pikta. Nasula hena eoka trapina. Dako hena okachni oyan pikta. Chante hena eoka trapina. Dako hena okihi oyan pikta. You can togashila. Hena dako hena nape onkoni chigna kapi. Yunka unchi makha unchi kakas ina hoye waye yunka unchi nitrako jaki lechet unhiota kamna wo yukchon kaka pikta yukha unchi hena unshi unkilapina hena tako hena yechetukte yukha makasi tomnia tako hena wichoi chake tako hena walakapi cha tongashila hena okihi oyan pikta. Dakuashtekta yung kalechel omnicha el okihoya pikta. Homitakoye oyasi. I would like to explain to you just what I said. Mitakoye oyasi encompasses that each life form somehow connects on this maka, uchimaka, our world as we know it. And it says we are basically related and we are basically connected. What happens here goes around the world. Makasitomnia, meaning that we somehow realize that the world was round. And we somehow realize that what happens here will happen around 4 directions and come back around to us. And the changes that we see, some are natural, some are man-made. So we have to realize the balance of life, the blessings that we see every day, we have to acknowledge. Mitakoye oyasi, that we were all connected. Our waters are connected. Our thoughts are connected. Everything that we do, we think might be just ours and ours alone, but that is not so. Everything that we do and think and say connects to everything on this world. So with that, the balance that we walk, we have to realize that we are so blessed that we have to be grateful and that we must watch over those blessings of Wichozani, the good health, whether it'll be physical, in the heart, intellectual, or emotional. We must carry that good health within us. And we must never forget that there are 4 parts to each of us: the feelings, the emotions, the compassion. And then we must remember too that intellect is always going to make a difference in our lives. Whether we want to learn something new every day, that is always upon us. And our bodies, we must remember that our bodies need good food, good medicine. And so with all that being said, then we come to the fact that each of us carry these things within ourselves. And each of us connect together. And like James said, I've known him for over 20 years, and he was such a blessing and still is. And the mentors that I had, yes, they are such a blessing to me as well. Even those that have gone on, they have left what I call an imprint. And so with that being said, we have to look at the 7 generations before us. The Lakota people believe that when you make plans, that when you look toward the future, you must look 7 generations. And within those 7 generations, each of us leave what we call a COE, a track, a footprint, if you will. I call it an imprint. An imprint that our generations can follow. The 7 generations behind us will have an imprint to follow. So with that being said, let's keep in mind one thing that I had learned in working with James and others throughout the years. I have learned that we are in this together. It's not indigenous people. It's not another culture. It's not cultures within us. It is all of us. We are all in this together. And let's keep that in mind as we move forward. And I have been so honored to be asked to say this prayer. I have asked the 4 winds to look upon us and touch our heart, touch our minds, touch our bodies and our spirit, that we give our all into this. Ho, mitakuye oyasi. Pilamaya.
Thank you, Ione Wopila Tonka, for that great prayer, and also those words of encouragement to help us understand, again, our purpose and our place in this world. I'm always humbled by Ione, again, and her way of how she talks to us, and it's for all of us, not just us in leadership role, but it's for all of us. And so I'm grateful for her and her leadership, and she continues to strive to make our people better, stronger, and prepared for the future. Now, again, it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend. What happens when you bring a rattling leaf and a wildcat together? I don't know. I don't know, but it's got to be good, right? But my good friend, I tease him a lot. He's my friend. He's my brother, and he's my colleague. And you have his bio in front of you, but I just sort of wanted to say one of the most things I admire about Dan was his relationship with Wayne Deloria, one of our great intellectuals, and he's from our people, the Lakota people, Dakota people. And Dan's done a great work with that, and he's going to talk to us about things that he's been working on. And he's a longtime travel college professor. He was a former travel college president, and he survived it. He's still here with us. And so, Dan, you're a brother. We're so grateful that you're here. We're honored that you're going to kick off this webinar series. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Wopilo. Thank you, brother.
Yeah.
All to you, Dan.
Sonlay Gadasawa, Songeli, Zoyaha, Yuchiha, Muskogee. Good morning, everyone. How are you? I am a Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma, and just honored to be invited to offer this kind of inaugural, session ESA is offering about traditional ecological. I always use the plural, knowledges, and I will explain why in a minute. But I want to express my gratitude and my honoring for this very place I'm sitting right now. I am, sitting on the ancestral homelands of the Kaw Nation, or sometimes called the Kanza people, Kaw people. And I'm not more than a stone's throw, maybe less than half a mile from the south bank of the Kansas River as it meanders across the north edge of Lawrence, Kansas. And I'm no more than 2 miles north of my campus, which sits on really the edge of the northern wetlands of the Wakarusa River, between two rivers. I'm mindful of water. I'm mindful of the land. I'm mindful of the air, the wind, and all of the life that surrounds me. So I want to honor those first earth caretakers of this place, the peoples of the Kaw Nation. And I want to honor all of that life that surrounds me, and even the very air I breathe, that gift of life I take every morning. And I think, that's important for us to do. That's probably the primary point to begin with if we want to really understand traditional ecological knowledges. So I always use the plural. Why? Well, because the definition I work with, and people can tweak it or modify it, see if they find it useful, but it's not mine alone. It's pretty widely shared. And that is that these knowledges, one that we talk about and we label as traditional and ecological in character, are knowledges that were born from a symbiotic relationship between peoples and a place. It's hundreds of years, thousands of years old in some cases, of this relationship, interrelationship between people and a particular landscape or seascape. So I always like to talk about traditional ecological knowledge as plural, because I want to acknowledge that Lakota TEK is very different from the TEK of my brothers and sisters on the Northwest coast, those Coast Salish peoples. And their knowledge in its content is substantively different than what my Dene or my Pueblo relatives of the Southwest would have. And of course, we can go from the Southern Plains to the Northern Plains. We can go to the Great Lakes. We can go to the woods of the Northeastern United States and even talk about the eastern coast of this Turtle Island. I think that it's all about relationships ultimately. And Ione did such a beautiful opening. I mean, you in one sense, listening to Ione speak is an honoring of that place where traditional ecological knowledges start. And if they are to continue, it will be born out of intergenerational transfers, sharing of knowledges between our ancestors, ourselves, and those future generations to come. It's because this is the first lecture, I'm going to frame my remarks really in terms of indigenous worldviews and philosophies, and draw heavily on the three most important influences in my life and work. First of all, the most important elders in my life, my mother and father, Barbara Irene Wildcat and Nathaniel Wildcat. You know, one of the greatest gifts we can have is having good, loving parents. We see what happens to children who don't have that. I was very fortunate, me and my brother, to have this incredible, loving parents, and here I am. I'm a product of that. I'm also very much shaped by my dear friend and mentor who James mentioned, co-author Vine Deloria Jr., clearly the giant of Indigenous intellectuals of the 20th century, and a bit of an iconoclast, a person who was always taking on those idols of Western civilization and Western traditions and saying, hey, not so fast here, you know. To other peoples on the world, we know something and it's valuable too. And so, you know, my parents, Vine Deloria Jr., and then I'd really be remiss if I didn't point out that my 35 years at Haskell Indian Nations University has tremendously shaped my scholarship and work, because we are the de facto international tribal colleges and universities. We are chartered by the United States Bureau of Indian Education, a part of the U.S. Department of Interior, to serve all federally recognized nations and peoples of the United States, at least the contiguous 48 states and Alaska. We are not by charter serving our Pacific Island relatives or Hawaiian Native relatives, although we often have them come join us in conferences, workshops, and NSF grants that we run. So, but that really disabused me of any kind of narrow ethnocentrism that I might have. So let me sort of move into a discussion about traditional ecological knowledges this way. I believe right now there may be no more important activity between peoples across our institutions than the activity that is promoting an ecological kind of framework, or if you will, worldview. My position is Indigenous peoples have held that kind of complex system thinking for hundreds and thousands of years, since time immemorial. That's not, and that's important to acknowledge. As we're sitting, many of us are working in institutions that are shaped by disciplines, by silos. We complain about them all the time, but we haven't really done much to change those institutions, have we? I think it's appropriate now that, you know, we do take seriously and respectfully the knowledge and wisdom that Indigenous peoples hold today. There's that apocryphal quote attributed to Einstein. No one can show where Einstein actually said it, but it sounds like something Einstein would say, you know, when he was at the Institute for Advanced Research at Princeton, and a colleague gave him a difficult problem to look at. And he said, well, lay it here. Yeah, he was busy at the time. Comes back the next day, his colleague comes back and says, well, what advice can you give us? And the quote goes something like this: remember, you can't solve problems with the same kind of thinking that created them. Traditional ecological knowledges did not play a role in creating the kinds of problems we see on our planet today. So we need a different worldview, a different way of thinking. I think Indigenous people have that, but I think this is where we immediately get into some very delicate ground that we've got to talk about. So first point, TEKs are about people and place, places. That's why I use the term TEKs, plural. And therefore, there are many traditional ecological knowledges. And they're a diverse compendium. They're as diverse as the ecosystems, environments, biomes of our planet, the Earth. And one of the challenges we have as we start talking about how we can work together and partner is something that today is very much a topic. And that's the issue of sometimes what people will couch as data sovereignty or knowledge sovereignty or intellectual sovereignty. And that is, how do we build partnerships in such a way that we don't see non-native people treating this knowledge in a way that they've treated the earth itself? In other words, it's an extractive activity. We're going to extract what's valuable, you know, from those Lakota or those Dakota peoples. And that is an issue. That is a real challenge. And so I'd like to just spend just a few minutes suggesting that before everyone gets paralyzed about, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? How am I going to, you know, interact with a community or with people of a place? You might have some desire to work with. I think the challenge is really it's embodied in the very fabric of TEK. It's the notion of relationships. And I think that one of the real challenges for people who are working in the academy is, first of all, as my good friend Roger Powardi out at the NOAA lab there in Boulder likes to say, this might be an issue because the world has problems and our universities have departments. We've got to figure out a way, okay, to understand that a meaningful relationship and exchange of knowledge will first and foremost be dependent on trust. And trust isn't something you gain by signing a contract. Trust isn't necessarily something you will get through an IRB. And traditional ecological knowledges, I think, pose a really fascinating prism to what is so valuable in indigenous traditions and what is so missing in the modern world. It is the absence of meaningful, trust-based engagement and relationships in a world where we increasingly view everything as a transaction or through a transactional lens. Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir. You're ecologists. You all know better. But what I want you to remember is that we're going to have to take the time to invest in building relationships between ESA and indigenous peoples, indigenous institutions, communities. You've got a great leader and advocate in this section with James Rattlingleaf. You know, it's what James is all about, good relationships. being in right relationship with those you work with. And that's really, you know, the cornerstone of how you approach traditional ecological knowledges. So as I've said, think of the way that people learn to live, how to hunt, how to fish, how to gather things. Maybe they were in the forest, underneath the forest canopies. The knowledge that fundamentally is traditional ecological knowledge was knowledge that was never separated out from one's life activities and the way of life, how they live. James will hopefully this will give James a fond memory. I remember our dear friend Oscar Coagley, Yupik scholar, by the way, wrote a fantastic book, Yupik Worldview. And it talks about a Yupik worldview and its relationship to science. But Oscar, you know, on more than one occasion told me, Dan, if you want to understand the Yupik worldview, the best way to do it is not through a book, even my book. He said, you need to come to our fish camp sometime. If you could stay with my family at fish camp, you would learn a lot about our traditional ecological knowledge. So at one level, I think, you know, traditional ecological knowledge has existed and continue to exist as embodied knowledges. I think often there's a reluctance to write down traditional ecological knowledges, and I'm not sure that that reluctance isn't well earned. You know, it's kind of like maps and our use of GIS. Maps are primarily useful to people who don't know a place. But for people who know a place, have lived there for hundreds and thousands of years, they don't need a map. As useful as maps are, you've got to ask yourselves, well, to what use are maps and for whom? And I think that the character of traditional ecological knowledge, which I want to emphasize to all of you in ESA, because I want to say this and I want to be very clear, the work you are doing is maybe more important now than it's ever been, given the state of our planet. My position is we need fundamental cultural climate change if we're ever going to deal with the physical climate change. The problem is the way people look at the world and understand the world. As Vine, you know, always used to rail against, look, the world isn't a machine. We are in the presence of life itself, and it's living, and it's all about relationships. And I think that you know, so you need to be mindful of this, that people who are living with traditional ecological knowledges, this knowledge is embodied. It's like Oscar said, well, if you want to understand RTEK, you need to come to fish camp. Or, you know, someone might tell me, hey, if you want to understand, you know, the Anishinaabe or Anishinaabe peoples of the Great Lakes culture, well, you need to come up to our forest You need to come up to where our wild rice beds are. You need to go fishing with us. So I do think that this is tremendously rich. And in fact, I've written a piece last year, and it's unpublished, but I really called the piece Traditional Ecological Knowledge is an Antidote to Destruction. I think as long as as people are inattentive and unmindful to the relationships we humans are one small part of in these life systems around us, we are headed for trouble. The challenge for those of you scientists and who are not indigenous to a place or of indigenous peoples or heritage is that, it's going to take some time. You're going to have to build a relationship with a people. If you really want to get into an understanding or aware of the knowledges that reside in a place, I think that one of the things that ESA could do and advance in this is you've got to build on, the leadership that James is going to provide, and many of us across this Turtle Island who are sympathetic and in my case, very supportive of the work ESA does, because like I say, this is critical work now. We've got to restore this sense of our connectedness and our relatedness to the balance of life that surrounds us. I think one of the things that will be interesting is to take advantage of institutions that are often overlooked by national organizations, and that is our tribal colleges and universities. ESA needs to make a concerted effort to build relationships with tribal colleges and universities that, with the exception of a couple of us, Haskell, which serves all nations, and our sister institution, Southwest Polytechnic Indian Institute in Albuquerque, New Mexico, SIPI. They're sitting in the homelands or in their lands where they now reside. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity to build some really meaningful relationships, not just around the use of remote sensing. And don't get me wrong, I want to be careful here how I state this. So I'm not going to diss remote sensing or GIS or map making. Those are useful tools. But unless people who know places remotely also have that connection to the knowledge holders, the sensors on the ground, the peoples and places they are studying through satellite images, we're going to perpetuate this treatment of nature as if it's just this abstraction. Part of us not come to grips with this incredible relational feature that we have with it, with the earth around us, places that we call home. So I'm going to try to summarize a couple of points here because I want to keep room for plenty of questions. and comments and discussion. That's where the learning will actually take place. The first one is, and Ione, thank you for so eloquently addressing this in your invocation. And those Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota speakers have this embodied every time they pray. Matakiwe Oyase, to all of my relations, for all of my relatives. We've got to disabuse people throughout the modern world that we live amongst resources. If you want to understand traditional ecological knowledge, is point one, move the way you think from thinking that you live in a world full of resources to understanding that you live in a world full of relatives. Now, this brings a second point, a parallel point. What we've witnessed in the last year during a major pandemic, it seems like some people on the planet, particularly in the United States of America, who think that politics and a social contract is all about inalienable rights. In fact, some people don't even want to wear a mask because you're infringing on my rights. Well, when you live in a world full of resources, people get, all we argue about is rights. Who has the rights to that water? Who has the rights to that land? Who has the right to those resources? I'd argue we need a new paradigm. And if you move from living in a world full of resources to one full of relatives, guess what? Indigenous people hold precious rights as much as anyone, and liberties. We honor that. But we know those rights and liberties are baseless unless they are counterbalanced with inalienable and unalienable responsibilities we must honor. What a different pandemic experience we would have had if some people would have approached the wearing of masks not as an infringement of their inalienable rights, but as a fulfillment of inalienable responsibilities you have when you live among relatives. So this idea of moving from resources to relatives, counterbalancing rights with also inalienable responsibilities is critical to understanding the usefulness of traditional ecological knowledges. If we do that, I feel very confident that, you know, we all know how sustainability has been sort of greenwashed. There's not a major corporate polluter on the planet that doesn't have a sustainability statement now. Shell, Exxon, you name it. They've all, you go to their web pages, you'll find a statement about their principles of, and their values of sustainability. Well, you know, problem with sustainability, you've always got to ask, well, what is it exactly you want to sustain? Because we might not be all on board or talking about the same thing. So in our circles, and I mean our literally, and in the circles I move in, Indigenous circles, and those of you folks that are in ESA, we find ourselves speaking a lot about resilience. And I don't think that's a bad thing. But even with resilience, I think we've got to be sure that we're not kind of thinking of resilience as materials, you know, scientists and engineers, or a resilient material, something you can put a lot of stress on, and then, you know, when the stress is gone, it returns, right? It's resilient. It goes back to its original form. So you want to make I-beams out of steel that's resilient. It can take some stress, but you also want to know when that stress is gone, it goes back, okay, to its original form. I think to really capture people's imaginations, we need to talk about something I would call resilience plus. We don't want to just honor relatives and our responsibilities and sustain a certain way of life or material affluence. What we really want to do is to live better, to live more richly, to have our lives enhanced. So I'm advocating we think about something called Resilience Plus. The work you members of the Ecological Society of America can do in building responsible and respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples to further deep ecological understanding of our human place in the world and the responsibilities that we have, as I said, is crucial now. I can't think of any more important work right now. So I would suggest, just keep in mind, let's live our lives, let's do our work, not in a world full of resources, but in a world full of relatives. And then we can disabuse ourselves of the single-minded bias towards inalienable rights to recognize with those rights come responsibilities. And we've got to balance all of our relations with responsibilities to land, air, the water, the plants and animals we share this planet with. If we do that, I don't want to talk about sustainability. I don't even want to talk about resilience. I want to talk about promoting systems of life enhancement. We live in a world now where everyone's talking about systemic injustice. I believe the work ESA is doing, and particularly partnerships, respectful partnerships, responsible partnerships that can be done with Indigenous peoples, we might be able to promote a new kind of measurement of progress. And that would be, are we working to build systems of life enhancement? Not just our human lives, but all the lives we share this planet with. So Sanlai, Godasawa, thank you very much for the invitation. Let's do some questions. We have questions, James? Comments?
Hokahe. Wow. Good stuff, Dr. Wildcat, my friend and brother. We do have a question for you. One question is, what is a recommended approach for a researcher to take with asking for assistance with TEK?
Yeah, build a relationship. Build a relationship, and you know, find it. You know, here's something that's kind of interesting. We've talked about this a lot, and I know those of you who do a lot of field work know the importance of listening, of being mindful. If there's a community you want to work with, visit, but don't bring any papers with you and don't bring any proposals with you. Go to a powwow, go to their art market, go to a school event, go to a basketball game, and hang out and make some friends, build some relationships. And, you know, you would be surprised how by just doing that, people will reach out to you and they'll say, hey, you know, I've seen you around here lately. So who are you? What are you doing? You know, what's your name? And I think this, you know, this is the part, see, that people working on dissertations have problems with, because dissertations are still a part of that silo system and that bureaucratic higher education system. And, you know, committees don't want to give you time to build a relationship with the community. They want you to fill out the IRB form, present it, and get your signatures. I am here to say, that's not enough.
Mhm.
I believe you've got to have established some good relatives in that place.
Mhm.
And then you'll have someone who can vouch for you, someone who can stand up for you. It takes time, and the best communication skill you have is learn to listen and just hang out. Be there.
Oh, that's a good one, Dan. Thank you. We have another question here. This is about building relationships again. So
Yeah.
here's the question. We are aware of hierarchy within Indigenous communities. Don't we need to consider our approach to building relationships with that in mind, especially if we are thinking about learning about traditional knowledges, which might be held by certain people with the wisdom in this community? Question. Do we not need to be vetted as worthy to receive such knowledge?
Well, see, that's why you've got to have a relationship. You won't get vetted. You won't even ever be close to that kind of knowledge. You will be vetted once you enter a community.
Right.
And this is important to understand. There's nothing untoward about this. It's that idea that entering a community, not as a tourist, not the tourist view, but build some relationships with that community means that then people will start inviting you to things,
Mhm.
welcoming you to things. And then you'll start to build some credit, some trust.
Mhm.
And I think that's really what's critical because, looking at social relations from the outside, people say, oh, well, it's all about the tribal government. Well, it's about the tribal government and our treaty exercised, dealings with the federal government and exercise of sovereignty. But if you're talking about culturally custom and habit held knowledges, the tribal council is not going to necessarily be the repository where you're going to find those knowledge. So it's difficult, and it's sort of, so it is kind of part of kind of getting the lay of the land politically, socially when you get there. And I think it's always best, if you can have someone like James, at your shoulder to be walking you through and introducing you to people. And, that counts for a lot. But you're right. You're absolutely right. You've got to be mindful of that. And the best way to learn how you're going to navigate that is build some relationships and on the ground knowledge.
Thank you, Dan. That's great. Dan, we can't have a webinar without talking about the BIA.
Yeah. Yes.
We don't have enough time, but here's a question.
We don't have enough time. No, we don't have enough time. That's another program. That's another program.
Well, I like this question, so I get, as moderator, I get to choose a question. So,
okay.
Do we need new words? Question. Words like connection, or as you say, sustainability, just doesn't quite say enough. Scientists have been good about changing new words into their vocabularies. Maybe this is something we can work on together on.
Yes. So I do think there's some vocabulary opportunities here. So, I'm very critical of much technology and the way it's employed. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not against technology. But I will say this. I think what we need to do is to start framing very clearly the words we use. We need to build shared understandings about a vocabulary, and there are opportunities. I mentioned technology because people would often hear me and say, "Oh, you're just a Luddite. You're an Indigenous Luddite. You're against technology." No, I believe we need technology. That's who we are, humans, and our ancestors had tremendous technologies they develop through their relationships with places. But what we need is this ability to recognize that in the place of progress, which is so anthropocentric and technology oriented, we need something different. So my suggestion is, let's talk about building systems of life enhancement. And so it's a substitute for progress. No one wants to be labeled anti-progress. I don't want to be labeled anti-progress, but we need a new benchmark for progress. It's not all about human comfort, convenience, and our capital growth in terms of our, investments and portfolios. It's about, okay, are we in responsible relationships with the life around us? So I said, let's promote systems of life enhancement. And everyone's talking about systemic change today. And again, so here's the added value of the work ESA does and traditional ecological knowledge is performed is they fundamentally frame correctly, I think, the questions of justice. And they are systemic frameworks. The largest system we are a part of, this life system of the planet. And we haven't been paying very much attention to that system lately. We've got to start paying attention. So thank you, ESA, for promoting that kind of thing. I mean, that's the kind of work we need desperately now.
Dan, I want to do one more question, then we gotta shut down. But
okay.
So we have one more question. This is and I'm glad you mentioned this benchmarks idea. So let's go global for a bit. I know you have a global thinker. What about the Sustainable Development Goals? I'm sure you're well aware of that. How did the intergovernmental bureaucracies can be more respectful to TEK? If they do, or if they should, or if they have? Well,
they should obviously be more respectful. Again, I think one of the things that we've got to do is, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change still, at this point, does not recognize, collectively, kind of as formally seated participants in the convenings of the IPCC that you can attend. They have special sessions on Indigenous peoples, but they're not really seated as active participants unless they do so under a larger nation state. I think that we've got to really push all of the international agencies, all of our NGOs, all of our intergovernmental organizations to honor Indigenous peoples. And I think ESA can be a great advocate for this, that reminding them that we know something. We possess worldviews, philosophies that aren't responsible for the decline in biodiversity, the incredible degradation of ecosystems, biomes on the planet. So it's time to pay attention and to honor and do so respectfully. That comes again with all those cautions we've got to take about how you undertake that. But I think I'm going to be hopeful. I think there's a window now for some great steps forward to be made. And, all of us have an opportunity now to see if we can do work that will make us good ancestors for those generations that will follow us.
Wopila Tanka, Dan. Great.
Sanlai, James.
Great talk. And it's been really, it's an honor to be with you again today, even though we have not seen each other for many years because of the COVID and just the busyness of life. We're honored that you're with us to kick this off in a good way. So we come to the end of our webinar now, and I just want to thank everybody for attending. We have over 130 people, Dan, come to listen to you, and also want to extend my gratefulness to Ione Quigley again for opening us up in a good way. You know, we're all a part of this work. We're grateful for ESA, Jonathan Miller, who's been communications person to help us organize these TEKs. And so I want to remind the audience again before you go that this is a webinar series. So we plan to have monthly webinar series on TEK. Many voices are going to come into this conversation, Dan. And so with that, that's a slide of our next presenter, Miss Ellen Simmons. And so look forward to that next month. So mark your calendars. And so with that, Dan, again, thank you. Wupila Ione, thank you again. And so let's close and have a good weekend. Everybody take care and be safe. Thank you. That's all very much. Take care.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye.
That was really great.
Bye.